President, many of us will be back in our home states and focused on paying tribute and remembering those who have served. There are 2 days every year when this nation focuses special attention on those who have served. Memorial Day coming up this weekend, as well as Veterans Day. And I plan to approach this Memorial Day, much as the others, by expressing gratitude to those who have served and honoring the memory of those who have sacrificed their lives for our freedom. When you serve in the military, supporting your buddy is everything. So as we honor the memory of those lost in action, we know that they would want us also to care for their buddies. Advances in military medicine since the Vietnam War have made it possible for many to survive the wounds of war that they would not have otherwise been able to do in earlier conflicts. But these veterans still do not return as they left, and many more return to the scourge of post-traumatic stress disorders. Now, I would like to be able to tell the veterans of Alaska that their federal government is doing right by them. But when it comes to the matter of health care, and particularly the failings that we see of the choice program, I can't in good conscience tell them that things are better in Alaska. Now, it's been a while since I have been to the floor to speak, I think, in relatively bleak terms about the care that our veterans receive in Alaska. Because for some while, things had been improving. They had been improving for much of the last 8 years, but now it seems as if this pendulum is swinging the other way. When I came to the Senate 13 years ago, Alaska veterans who lived someplace other than the metropolitan area of Anchorage or Fairbanks or the Kenai Peninsula, they really didn't, if you lived outside of those areas, you really didn't think about the VA healthcare. Those who lived in those 4 communities, they were able to gain their care. It worked for them. But if you didn't live where the VA lived, and you weren't eligible for beneficiary travel, the VA just didn't mean much to you. It wasn't as if it was going to be anything that was going to help any of our vets. That was the status quo. And it really didn't show much sign of changing. But Alaskans really began to challenge the status quo during the Second Gulf War. Operation Iraqi Freedom resulted in a large-scale deployment of our Alaska National Guard members from throughout the state. At one point, there were about 89 different Alaska communities that were represented in the Middle East, and it was fully apparent that when these men and women returned home, when these heroes returned home and they were released from active duty, the VA was really not prepared to meet their needs. So VA Secretary Nicholson, he came to Anchorage in 2006. He heard this loud and clear from Alaska's Veterans Service Organization. And that really created a groundswell to turn the Alaska VA into a more veteran-centric direction. And it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. There's a familiar slogan out there that says, it doesn't matter who wins an election. The bureaucracy always wins. And that was kind of a way of life in the Alaska VA healthcare system. But we developed a pretty strong ally when Secretary Shinseki came on board. During his tenure as secretary, we saw 3 significant changes from the status quo. First thing that happened was the VA began contracting with Alaska's tribal health care providers to care for our veterans, both our native veterans and our non-native, who lived outside the reach of any VA facilities. So if you're a veteran living in Bethel, doesn't make any difference if you're native or non-native, you could receive care through the tribal health care providers. And they were compensated by the VA at the same encounter rate that the Indian Health Service pays them. So the second thing that we saw with Secretary Shinseki, I had commissioned an Inspector General's inquiry into the allegations that the VA was sending our Alaska vets to Seattle and to other points even further than Seattle for care that could be purchased from community providers in Alaska. It was a situation where literally you had a veteran who was dealing with cancer, needed radiation or chemotherapy treatment, and they were being sent to Seattle for a series of treatments, when that same treatment could be provided in Alaska, in Anchorage, in Fairbanks. Secretary Shinseki brought an end to that practice. And then the third thing that changed was the VA hired a creative executive with deep experience in Alaska health care market to lead the Alaska VA healthcare system. And even better, the VA senior leadership actually empowered her to do the right things for Alaskan veterans. And so when that director began to see waiting lists forming for primary care and behavioral health services in Anchorage, she took the initiative. She enlisted non-VA providers to come in and work with them to solve the problems. And so we were in a pretty unique situation. We didn't suffer the waiting lists that veterans in the lower 48 saw, because we had somebody that was at the helm, saw the problem, said, we can be creative if we have a little bit of flexibility, and we can work to address our veterans' need. The model was pretty simple. If a veteran needed to see someone outside the VA, they were placed with that outside provider by VA staff. And these are VA staff people in Alaska, people who know Alaska's geography, who know that you can't drive from Bethel to Anchorage, who know the breadth and limitations on services available within our state. And then the bill for the services was sent to the VA. It was not sent to the veteran. So if for some reason a provider isn't paid on time, the veteran was insulated. They were protected from collection agency calls. Now, it wasn't a perfect system, it wasn't without complaints, but on balance, this was the best Alaska's veterans were ever treated. And then came the Phoenix scandal, and we had hoped that what had happened there, the spotlight that was shown on the VA as a result of a horrible scandal in Phoenix, we hoped that it would not affect the good things that we were doing in Alaska. 2 years later, I can tell you that things have changed profoundly and unfortunately not for the better. The Choice Act seems to have been the catalyst for unraveling the VA's reforms in our little corner of the world. And let me explain why. When we were presented with the Choice Act, I looked at it as this is going to be another tool that the VA could use to help expedite care to veterans who couldn't get their care in a timely fashion. So if this is another tool in the toolbox, this is going to be good for our vets. But the VA didn't view the Choice Act simply as another tool. They viewed the Choice Act as the single answer to care outside the VA. And to this day, the VA seems to almost resent the fact that a variety of other purchase care programs coexist with the Choice Act. And they work to undermine them through a hierarchy of care policy that makes it impossible for local VA officials to use the community providers with whom they have built these relationships. That whole unraveling was enough to send our creative, innovative Alaska VA director into retirement. And unfortunately, that position has been vacant since. Oh, and by the way, when veterans question the VA about why things have changed, what's happened here? We had a good system, it was working, what has happened? The VA talking points said, blame the Congress. They gave us the Choice Act, there's nothing we can do with it. And that is an entirely disingenuous response, given that all of the purchase care authorities were on the books before the Choice Act continued. So they were on the books already, and they continued on the books after Choice came on. The VA had the flexibility before the Choice Act to craft local solutions, and they had the same flexibility to do so after the Choice Act. The decision not to support local flexibility was a deliberate choice, and it was a choice of the bureaucracy, not a choice that was mandated by the Congress. So really, how has the Choice Act been working out in the state of Alaska? I spent a lot of time back home, and I spent a lot of time visiting with our veterans, and I'm listening hard. And every now and again, I do hear a veteran who says, yeah, I think things are okay. I think I'm getting the care that I want. But more often than not, what I'm hearing from our vets is that instead of the Choice Act, it's called the Bad Choice Act, or no choice at all. For a while, it seemed that the Native partnerships would be subsumed in choice. And we pushed back on that, and we won, thankfully. But for our veterans who need specialty care, the Choice Act, the Choice Program, has been a tough road to hoe. A couple examples. There was an elderly Tlingit gentleman from Southeast Alaska. He was sent to Seattle for a form of cancer therapy that is not available in Alaska. And in the middle of his episode of care, he was told, you're going to have to return to Alaska. And it was only after days on the phone with the VA and to the Choice contractor, each who was pointing the finger at the other, that the problem was resolved. Meanwhile, this veteran was essentially telling his family, you better prepare for a funeral. It was that dire. Then there was the veteran who was scheduled for neurosurgery. This veteran was told that her referral from the Anchorage VA was rescinded, and she would need to go to the Choice program for another. So she calls the Choice contractors hotline that she was referred to for behavioral health providers. Eventually, the individual, she's talking to this person on the other end of the helpline who didn't know what neurosurgery was. When the particular problem was resolved, the neurosurgeon was no longer available, and the veteran was stuck on painkillers until her surgery could be rescheduled. Not a good outcome. Then another one, a veteran living in Juneau, our capital city. He was under the ongoing care of a local ophthalmologist, but that doctor didn't take Choice. So the veteran calls the 800 number for another referral, and he was told, well, you can drive to Sitka to see an ophthalmologist there. Well, if you're listening to this and you're from Alaska, you would be laughing now because you know that there is no road from Juneau to Sitka. They're both islands. So the other reason that you might raise an eyebrow is not only can you not drive there, but there's no ophthalmologist in Sitka. The Choice participant was an optometrist. So think about how this veteran feels when you call the 800 number up and you're told, just drive down to the next town. Can't drive, and oh, by the way, that specialist doesn't exist there. Now, the VA and the Choice contractor claim to have fixed these problems, but for every problem fixed, there's still a veteran with a new one, a veteran who has lost faith with the Choice program, and a provider who no longer wants the hassle of taking Choice. One provider told me that the amount of time that his staff has to spend on the phone with the Choice program is disruptive to his practice. It's unfair to the other patients who aren't getting the attention that they need from the office staff. So I don't want to stand here and complain without offering solutions. There is a solution to Choice's problems in the state of Alaska, and that solution is to go back to the way that we had it. Local VA partnering, local providers with local patients. So people here do the partnering with the providers, with the patients. So the Senate Appropriations Committee has urged the VA to reinstate this model in Alaska through language that is included in the FY17 report. But I'm really not sure where it's going given the current VA leadership. The rapport, unfortunately, is just not there. Toward the end of Secretary Shinseki's tenure, members of the Veterans Affairs Committee in the other body berated the VA for its poor congressional relations. But I will tell you, when I needed to talk to the Assistant Secretary, or for that matter, to Secretary Shinseki, they were right there. And even if the results didn't come as quickly as I would have liked them to, that team was clearly delivering for our folks in Alaska, but I cannot say the same for the current team. Through the FY15 VA Appropriations Bill, I demanded a report on how the VA would service Alaska's vets under the Consolidated Choice Program that we legislated last summer, and we still haven't seen that report. During our recent appropriations hearings, I raised concerns about how personnel vacancies and management issues in the Alaska VA were affecting performance. And Dr. Shulkin took issue with that characterization. He offered to show me some metrics, still waiting. And then just last week, he sent a young doctor from Philadelphia who he is charged with running purchase care up in Alaska. The report back is that he was tone deaf to criticism of choice lodged by our veterans and the providers, and he suggested that the rate being paid to the native health system to do work that the VA should be doing themselves was unjustifiably high. So this is really very, very troubling. So we learned that the VA is hiring a bunch of new execs to help this individual manage a nationwide community care program. I tell you, I remain very, very concerned. Long before the Phoenix scandal, the VA was purchasing community care using a decentralized model. Now it seems to abruptly be moving to a centralized model. And I don't know how well centralized models work in other parts of the West or rural communities in other regions, but I can tell you they just don't work in a place like Alaska. One size fits all is not the model that best serves our veterans. But this seems to be the direction that we're moving toward. And to make matters worse, we're not even debating what we want community care in the VA to look like. We've got 100 members who have a stake in the outcome, but only a few seem to be involved in that discussion. The votes always seem to be pretty much straight up or down, no opportunity for amendment. We've done that now twice, in the first instance with the Choice Act itself, and then again last year when we had to bail the VA out because its healthcare programs had gone insolvent they would have gone insolvent during the August break if we hadn't done so. But we need to address this. You can't keep writing the check for the VA. We have to have that reform, and that reform needs to be real and it needs to work. Last week, the senator from Arizona proposed a 3-year extension of the Choice program, but there were some changes in the way VA pays providers in the purchase care arena, and there was some problematic language that I had, so I wasn't able to support his amendment at that time. But since then, he has worked with us, which I greatly appreciate, and the chairman of that committee. We've worked to resolve those problems. So I can now support the 3-year extension in the Choice program that he proposes. So I think it is important. Again, take the time. Let's get this right. But again, I think we need to make sure that we have come to terms that we know what we want care outside the VA to look like. I think there's still some huge problems in the implementation of the Choice program that we need to address, and unfortunately these problems are profound in the smaller and harder to get places like Alaska. I think it's high time that we give the VA clear direction about the value we place on access to veteran health care in those smaller and hard to get places. In many cases, we know the dynamics of our local healthcare markets better than the folks in a VA central office. Fixing purchase care begins with directing the VA to collaborate with members of this body, not necessarily playing people off one another so that once again the bureaucracy wins. We can't sit while the VA blames us for failings that that need to be owned, failures that might have been avoided through collaboration with those who know their localities best. So, Mr. President, I appreciate the opportunity to spend a few minutes on the floor this evening talking about how we make good, how we pay tribute to those who have served us. Memorial Day is but once a year, Veterans Day is but once a year, but every day we need to be honoring and thanking those who serve us. And when we say thank you for your service, let's show them that we mean it. And holding the VA's feet to the fire on results is one way to do that. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.